Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing the Dark Underbelly of Route 66. Actually, this is part 2. But first, we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Route 66 is known as Americana incarnate, freedom on the road, kitsch over-the-top attractions, a ribbon of asphalt out of time and space. So what is so dark about Route 66?
Route 66 was always more than just carefree adventure. Even when it was brand new, the myth of the Freedom Road was built around more than a few dark corners. Add in criminals on the run, kitsch locations that were not all family friendly, and throw in some very dark and spooky roadside stops, and you have the making of the dark underbelly of the Mother Road.
We will return to Route 66, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first run copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook, and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Dark Underbelly of Route 66, Part 2, with an emphasis on devils.
Yes. Devils in the name, in the place, and in a few men.
That's right. Certainly a lot of allegory is associated with this. A lot of historical context is associated with this. A lot of troublesome times are associated with this. And sometimes, certainly in the perspective of the naming, perhaps even the literal personification based on the people who were naming the places as well.
Very true. Very, very true. And, I think when you are talking about devils on Route 66, you have to focus a little bit on the fact that this has always been a conduit for crime, for illicit activities, for people trying to lose themselves from a past that they're trying to forget, etc. And we encourage everyone to check out the part 1 episode where we go into a lot of detail on things on the far east end of Route 66 in the Ozarks. But I think that it does bear merit to just revisit for a minute the personification of that motif really came out of the 1930s and Depression era gangsters and outlaws. And on Route 66, that probably is summed up best by Bonnie and Clyde.
I would agree. Really quickly, we do want to give a shout out for next week's episode. We are going live.
That's true.
Your questions, and we are going to have it set up so that you can email Dark Ozarks or Facebook message questions you'd like us to cover. And you can also include comments of us, comments to us as the video is rolling, as we're going live, and we'll have it set up so that we can read those comments. So going to try something new. It's going to be fun, entertaining. We're just going to jump right off the cliff on that. And so we do invite you to tune in next Wednesday. It's going to be a lot of fun. And who knows what we're going to talk about.
That's right. We don't even know.
No, no, we don't. It'll be like the old days.
Yes. And back to Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes. What? No, I want to on a springboard on this, which we did the walking tour in downtown Joplin
Yes.
here just a few weeks ago. We've done several of those, and one of the initial stops on the tour, the Swartz House, and
Yes.
you mention the association with Bonnie and Clyde, and immediately folks perk up their ears and begin to listen intently.
Well, it's interesting, I think, because even for people in this part of the country, I think a lot of people don't associate Bonnie and Clyde with the Ozarks region. And partly because when they met, they both were living in Dallas, Texas. They died in Louisiana. And so that nationally, that's where a lot of the story is focused on, is that their finale, their tragic end in Louisiana. But a good portion of their story is in the Ozarks, and including the part that helped form the nebulous that eventually 30 some years later became myth with the movie.
It did. And first of all, I think it's interesting just to note that harkens to a theme that we see. And we're not just saying this because we're biased toward the Ozarks, but it is a theme that is historically borne out, is that many of these iconic 20th century motifs that you see in TV and movie and film, as well as literary motifs of this great American sagas, particularly associated with the Great American West, but a variety of these concepts are concepts that are rooted in a historical reality that began in the Ozarks, or perhaps exclusively occurred within the Ozarks. And as the lore, as history became modern American legend, and it became translated to for example, to film or to TV. Interestingly enough, it was being translated predominantly out of Hollywood, and they were filming in big Western locations, although the story itself was originating from the Ozark Highlands.
Exactly. So we don't always associate, for all of those reasons, we don't always associate this story here, but from their first bank robbery on their own in Oronogo, Missouri, to the hideout in Joplin, Missouri, to their first kidnapped policeman in Springfield, Missouri, to their last kidnapped police officers and shooting in Commerce, Oklahoma. It was all in the Ozarks.
It was very, very fascinating. And I think realistically, more than just coincidence, there was geographical and topographical and state line rationale for their travels within the space.
Yes, and Bonnie had spent a good deal of time in her teenage years actually visiting family in Commerce, Oklahoma. So she was somewhat familiar with the area and already knew people in the area who helped hide them, who helped give them aid when needed. So all of these connections that go across country and go across state lines come into play.
They do. They do. And it really, again, it feeds into this mythos of the open road.
It really does. It really does. And also, we mentioned in the beginning the theme of, devils in the Ozarks. And that aptly kind of applies to this story because it's ironic. It still surprises me how much intense emotion we tend to see sometimes when the subject is brought up on our pages and so forth, of people really being emotionally angry about this story. And we're going on it's 90 years basically ago. And people being upset that basically there are folk heroes in America.
And that those folk heroes do have certainly a dark genre,
Mhm.
and some of that is of course, removed when the folk hero, the folk anti-hero, is not capable of being the one to point a gun at you in a dark corner. It's much easier to romanticize them, but certainly there is a vicarious surviving against unwanted authority that speaks into it in a way that realistically Johnny Appleseed does not.
Very true. And for those that grew up in that time period, there was an understanding of that because of the nature of the Great Depression and what people, particularly in Middle America, went through with foreclosures and hard times. And if you look at the newspapers of the time, they were not being romanticized at all. And it was very clear that people were fearful of this kind of just wanton crime going up and down the roads. But by the same token, if it's going to happen, at least they're sticking it to the banks.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not after your money, we're just after the bank's money.
Exactly. And so you had many law-abiding citizens who, did not condone the violence, did not condone the crimes themselves, but weren't necessarily brokenhearted over the fact that the banks were having a hard time after so many people had lost their farms and houses, etc.
Yes. And part of this narrative, which of course we will be bookending this discussion with Billy Cook, but I think that it aptly begins with Clyde Barrows, is a certain aspect of, certain aspect of failure with the earlier penitentiary system in terms of on the surface, a what appears to be justice the way it was meant to be, making sure that anyone who isn't law-abiding gets properly punished and sent away so that they can be reformed. But a much darker reality, and we've touched on this with the coverage of the penitentiary in Jefferson City, which is now open for tours and closed for business, of the of the judicial kind. But it's haunting, really, when you begin to look just at the historical realities that, comparatively speaking, you have a pastoral state, and in the case of Jefferson City, a beautiful small city that is our state capital. And then on a comparatively small chunk of land, you have a fortress, inside of which almost unspeakable crimes are being committed by the inmates to the inmates on a very regular basis.
Yes, and very young offenders that today a lot of these offenders would not have been sent there to begin with, including most likely Clyde Barrow and Billy Cook, as we will talk later. In both cases, they ended up in jail over theft and relatively minor crimes, and basically came out of prison schooled in better ways to commit larger, more violent crimes.
And certainly the counterproductivity of the system in a situation where troubled but impressionable teenage boys, let's be serious, I mean, honest, this is what we're dealing with, boys that today we would be like, there's no way that they would be sent into these situations.
Right.
At the time, were being sent into these situations without a lot of, from what we can tell, certainly a lot of society giving any pause about it whatsoever.
No, or, to be honest, really even precautions in place to prevent very atrocious behavior happening to them. And so, in the case of Billy Cook, as it comes out later, you have a judge even saying basically society created this situation, and there's a lot to that. And then with Clyde Barrow, you're getting out, when he does get out of jail, what he went through was brutal enough that he cut off one of his own toes to get out of a shackle to get away from a bad situation. And when he gets out, then basically the depression is hit, times are hard, can't hardly get a job, and one bad decision leads to another. And that often is a theme in these kind of stories, and it's happened up and down Route 66. So,
it has.
But you have to look at that in the context of what was going on in 1932 versus 2023.
And it's a very different world. And in many cases, spoiler alert, despite what you might have absorbed in the 24/7 news cycle, in many cases, it is a safer and much less violent world.
Yes. On last week's episode, we had someone ask, did we say that crime was worse then than now? And in a lot of categories, yes. And particularly the categories that we're talking about, yes. And I think that that's something, again, that people fail to filter through, but it's a good backdrop to the underbelly of Route 66.
It is. And as you mentioned, the Mother Road was something of the dark Mother Road in terms of transiting crime across the nation.
It always has been, even before it was Route 66, whether it was basically counterfeiters or outlaws in the Old West. I mean, even if you go back to the 1830s and John Avey, the Ghost of the Ozarks, basically they were traversing the trails that became Route 66. So it goes back a long ways. And in part one, we covered a lot of area in the far east Ozarks. So I think we can kind of jump off at Jerome.
I like that. And for people who are familiar with I-44 today, they may recognize Jerome Hill. It's a big hill as you come down to the river, and it stands out. It's always stood out to me, and it has been really settled to some degree since the early days.
Yes. And see, exactly, yeah. I mean, approximately how many miles out of St. Louis is it? It's not that far.
Well, I mean, it's Phelps County.
It is Phillips County.
Yeah.
It's true, it is that far. It is that far. Um,
It's
but
I mean, it's on the Gasconade River, and the old
okay,
bridge.
yeah, it is. It is. I was thinking it was a little bit further, but
Yeah.
an interesting point is that it's always been sort of a hub of transportation. It was the western terminus of railroads for a very long time.
Yes, and that is powerful in and of itself. I mean, certainly during the Civil War, it might come as a surprise to some people that the railroad did not reach Springfield, Missouri.
No, no. About 100 miles shy of reaching Springfield. Roughly.
And it's a testament to the development of infrastructure, state infrastructure, national infrastructure that we honestly take for granted, that we can traverse these spaces without thinking about these huge hills, these huge valleys, these bluffs, these ridges. We can get on I-44 and complain about the traffic without realizing that, back in the day, before the Civil War, this was a hell of a trip.
It was. This reminds me, you saying that reminds me, I have a story about Jerome Hill.
Yes.
And this was from my early days of practicing law, and had an office in Springfield, and actually had an office up in Rolla. And my law partner and I were driving I-44, and Rick was driving, and we were going up Jerome Hill. And as you know, as you get close to the summit of the hill, you can't see the other side of the hill. And I end up attributing this to the fact that he was a philosophy major. So we're driving, probably 80 miles an hour. And suddenly he slams on the brakes in the middle of the highway, to the point I go forward, catch myself on the dashboard, and look at him and say, "What the hell was that for?" Serious as a heart attack. He looks at me and says, "Well, I don't know if the road's on the other side." To which I said, "This is a hell of a time to have an existential crisis."
uh, it's like the Continental Divide.
Pretty much, but that is an illustration of it is quite a hill.
It is. It really, really is, and it is. It's a dominating space. There in the mid Missouri Ozarks on I-44, and of course on Route 66. Before that, interesting, and this is just a bit of more just contextualizing the history of it, but the Jerome area, because of the Gasconade and the Big Piney Rivers, became a long-standing hunting fishing resort area for the comparatively well-off and quite well-off of St. Louis at the turn of the 20th century. You could take a train, a weekend train, specifically to Jerome from St. Louis. and and then as train travel started giving way to automobile travel, that trend continued,
Mhm.
and we're looking, and some of the structures are in and around Jerome that now are largely abandoned, have a really really interesting nod to this to this history. And something else that really begins the process, and I want to jump from here over to Devil's Elbow in just a moment. I want to go
Okay.
there with it, but something that we begin to see, of course, this was before the auto directed campaign of Land of a Million Smiles. We're seeing something really interesting develop here. We're seeing comparatively wealthy urban sports vacationers,
Mhm.
hunter fisher folk coming from the city to these previously very very rural and comparatively isolated locations, locations that really the only connection that they largely have with the outside world is the train tracks. And I think it speaks to probably some of the uh just the momentum of the Gilded Age, that we see the burgeoning of an upper middle class to a middle class that suddenly can afford to spend money on vacation again after the Civil War.
Right. And and it's not the robber baron rich on the East Coast, where that's what we tend to hear about and see. And on the East Coast, there seemed to be a bigger divide between those who could do these leisure activities and rest of society, whereas further west there were areas that you had more of the burgeoning upper middle class almost sooner than you did in some of the large metro areas.
And and of course many of the locations, surviving locations today that we cover and have covered, of haunted locations and grand mansions, etc., do speak to the development of wealth in the New West.
Mm-hmm.
And and along with that, we don't necessarily take into consideration that this wealth development and the industry, certainly you had the iconic likes of the Limps and the Limp Mansion and the Schifferdecker house, and these grand mansions. But all of this comparative, increasingly at the time stable industry was producing a middle class that suddenly could pay to do things that they would previously have been able to do. And that was accompanied with a heretofore unheard of capacity to enjoy quote unquote modern luxuries, like living in St. Louis and taking a weekend train to Jerome and suddenly finding yourself in the wilds of the Ozarks.
Very true. And as you said, especially after the interruption of progress with the Civil War and Reconstruction. So,
and as a consequence of this, you see what I think is of course, it's now 120 years past, but a really interesting clash of culture, because you have still the existence of a drastically rural, likely in many cases, not all, but in many cases, um, Southern leaning or Southern tendency Scots Irish peoples living in remote areas of the hills, suddenly in various aspects interacting with middle class and upper middle class urban Americans. It is two very different cultures coming together in these essentially um, sportsmen's and recreational river spaces.
Very true. Very true. I guess akin to, trying to think of a modern correlation of resort areas. Say resort areas in, say, Haiti or the Bahamas, that you have very affluent travelers going into areas that outside of the resort are impoverished and very rural and undeveloped.
Agreed. Agreed. The big cruise ship ports along the Yucatan definitely come to mind. That the the comparative wealthy of North America in 2 days can cruise to the absolute impoverished of Latin America, and enjoy a 5-star hotel at the same time. It's not dissimilar. And so from that, where I'm meandering with this clash of economic cultures direction here, is we have at the time, I think a class of people who certainly would see themselves as very modern, as very technologically advanced, and increasingly divorced from the trappings of the Victorian era, the funereal customs, etc., coming into direct contact with Ozarkers, Scots-Irish Ozarkers predominantly, as well as individuals influenced by or related to the Cherokee in association with the Trail of Tears, as well as old-time German settlers, etc., individuals with strong leanings toward a much older past, and introducing, certainly in the terms of folkloric exposure, old tales from the mountains that our urban recreationists might not have known quite what to deal with.
Very true. Very
Potentially
true.
starting with references to Devil's Elbow.
And just a lot of places with the moniker in it.
And as an introduction to this, the Devil's Elbow is a really, really tight bend in the river of the Big Piney River. And the community itself around Devil's Elbow was a lumberjack town as late as the 1870s. And of course, that speaks to the fact that vast tracts of the Ozarks were completely logged off to feed American expansion in the 1870s and 80s.
Well, and a lot of the rivers through there, people look at them today and don't think about them being navigable, but they were. A lot of them were actually much broader and faster or slower flowing, and through the logging causing debris and landslides over time, they've become more V-shaped, and where boats can't go up and down the rivers anymore. So where we have a lot of rivers that people think of basically as just sort of recreational and natural, 150 years ago, they were commercial.
They were. And of course, I think one of the things that skews our modern perspective is that we think of navigable rivers as particularly barge traffic, large boat traffic, even ship traffic. And while many of the Ozark rivers, and there are many Ozark rivers, wouldn't necessarily sustain a large riverboat paddling all the way up in many locations. Osceola and the Osage River is an exception. and to a lesser degree Forsyth, and the Swan Creek landing on the White River being another exception. Oh, the rivers like the Gasconade and the Big Piney were navigable in terms of much smaller craft many times during the year, and in terms of logging, you could float logs down in massive, albeit incredibly dangerous, rafts.
Mm-hmm.
And it many times whenever the water was up.
Yeah.
So they were serving, the rivers were serving an incredibly important economic or commercial role, and like anything else of this nature, there were pros and cons. I mean, we're looking at the wholesale destruction of original Ozarks forest, the likes of which we only have just a handful of locations left in Missouri, and that is tragic. It is truly and genuinely tragic. At the same time, we are also looking at the means by which modern infrastructure that we honestly, for all of our complaining, oftentimes don't even complain about this because we are just so accustomed to being able to go wherever we want to, whenever we want to. And the undergirdings of this infrastructure was developed at this time.
It really was, and it wouldn't have happened except for that logging, to be honest.
No, and for the individual doing the logging, it was in many cases individualistic. It was small families, individual men working unbelievably hard to survive, and in some essence, genuinely live out the American dream.
Well, and another aspect of that is that people don't think about is that logging, the biggest portion of that actually went to railroad ties, and an enormous part of the proliferation of railroads west, including the Transcontinental Railroad, were laid down with railroad ties from the Ozarks.
Yeah. Something that in those iconic images of the Old West with the lone train track headed toward the mountains, and you look at that and you go, oh, that's so nostalgic, that's so iconic. Oh, wait a second, there's not a forest,
yeah,
of a hardwood forest to have supplied to have created these tracks until you get all the way back to Missouri.
Yeah, exactly. And Devil's Elbow has its own dark story, which we kind of alluded to earlier a little bit, but in 1968 it was the scene of a very tragic, gruesome murder, triple murder of 3 employees of a restaurant on base at Fort Leonard Wood. Restaurant was robbed by 2 brothers. About $3,600 was stolen. They took all 3 employees. It was after hours. They were cleaning up, took them hostage and drove them out to Devil's Elbow and murdered them.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it's very tragic in that we know who did it, and through a series of interplays between federal and state courts, the federal court decided that they couldn't be charged with the murders after they had already been convicted in federal court and were released, and the primary perpetrator basically disappeared and has been a fugitive from warrants in Phelps counties for 50 some years now.
Yeah. And it is tragic, and it's one of these crimes that we like to not think of happening in quote unquote the good old days.
That's true. But this is one that actually sometimes we have to be a little sensitive to families not wanting a crime to be discussed. This is one that the families have actually reached out in the past, because I've written about it previously, and thanked me for highlighting it, and they appreciated that basically it wasn't being forgotten over time. So sometimes it is good to talk about these things, and there's still a chance that the perpetrator's out there, because he was in his mid-20s at the time, and so he may still be alive. But the last best information was he was living in another state under an assumed name, and they hadn't been able to find him.
And I think one of the things that we really have to get away from, if we're going to effectively contextualize history as well as understand the present, is the idea that incredibly violent crime has taken place throughout all of our history.
Oh, it's human nature. Any way you look at it, human nature leads to these situations, and human nature has never changed that much.
No. No, it has not. And as part of that, and of course, in some cases, the crime against humanity is perpetrated by a single individual against another, in a fit of passion or tragedy, in terms of, in the case of, as we've discussed with Clyde Barrows and Billy Cook, having these young men unprepared for the level of trauma that they were experienced. Really, and we don't really talk about this, but I mean, in the level of having been put essentially in a prisoner of war camp, or having been brutalized during war. That's really the level of trauma that we're actually referencing. But in other cases, trauma, depravity, and ultimately death being sanctioned by the state. And that in the case of the Trail of Tears, one of which Trails of Tears from the 1830s, in regards to the relocation of the Cherokee from the Georgia, North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee location all the way to ultimately Oklahoma, intersects across these specific boundaries right around Devil's Elbow and Jerome.
Yes. So a lot of different events at different times that illustrate that this thoroughfare, which Route 66 was, as well as the trails before that, have always had that dark side to it. I want to let's skip over to Six Flags for a minute.
Okay.
Because we alluded to it in part one, but we really didn't talk about it. And it is pretty interesting. Of course, people know it as an amusement park near Stanton in western St. Louis County. And you've had your own experience there.
I have. I love Six Flags. I just want to put that out there as a disclaimer on that. I've been to Six Flags many times. I love Screaming Eagle. And Screaming Eagle is my favorite coaster out there, in part because of its historicity, but also just because it's an awesome roller coaster. But the place is great, but it is very evocative, especially as night begins to fall.
And that makes sense. And um, you had experience at the Arbors.
I did. And for people who are familiar with Six Flags, the Arbor will be recognizable. It's a very shady location on a hot summer afternoon, and it's over by between the Flume Ride and Dr. Freeze. If anybody wants to get their bearings there, but it is a huge archway covering that is upon which is growing a profusion of wisteria. It's very beautiful, but it is an area. I had the opportunity to be at Six Flags on one of the summer evening late park night events, and had wandered through the Arbor during the day, and this is interesting, and it's nice to be in the shade. And then as evening fell, it really took on a completely different energy, almost a passage through the veil type of space, and it resonated. Certainly for me, it was extremely evocative. I shared photos, and at the time I shared photos on Instagram, just on my personal account, because it just felt differently. And then interesting enough, research completely separately, research for this episode at yourghoststories.com specifically mentions the Arbor as a location of a haunting.
Yes, of a little girl. But and I like the bat story, which we've dug into further this week, and there's also associated tales of a ghost of a girl at the Holiday Inn, which previously was the Ramada Inn, there, with various people speculating about whether is it the same little girl or not. And so when you start digging into it, you get information that the area of the park, and particularly where the hotel is, previously was a pig farm, and that perhaps the haunting was associated with that. However, if you go back further, we dug into it this week, the area, that land was actually St. Louis County poor farm in the 1800s. And ironically, the building that is the hotel is built out of two original stone barns that basically have been renovated, added onto, extended, but the bones of the hotel are original to the poor farm from the 1870s. And there is a tale of a young girl dying by falling out of a window of one of those barns when it was the poor farm. And there are accounts that her name was Aggie, although in some accounts she's named as Stella, but it appears that her name was Aggie. And so most people associate the haunting in the hotel with that tale, and perhaps she is the one at the Arbor as well.
It's not that far apart.
No.
Comparatively.
And then ironically too, right behind the hotel is the Paupers Cemetery from the poor farm, and it was never moved. So if you stay at the Holiday Inn at Six Flags in St. Louis, behind the hotel is a cemetery. You just won't see any stones because most of them never had stones, or they just had markers, and those have been removed. But
it does give one pause.
it does. It does make you wonder if you're alone, if you're really all alone, when you're riding the roller coasters.
The it is for people who are not, and I was really struck by this. Again, we don't tend to associate St. Louis County and the immediate environs with the Ozarks, but even today, if you're on I-44 through these spaces, you're immediately struck by the hills. First of all, but second of all is I was there with my niece in 2019, and we got on at dusk. It was really beautiful. We got on the Ferris wheel at dusk, and at the crest of the Ferris wheel, I'm like, you notice the Sugarloaf Mountains? Because you look out over it. I mean, you're so close to St. Louis, but from that vantage point, you look and you see the mountains. You can see the ridges and the hills, and it's very, very powerful for me. I think it always gets me. And the number of locations throughout Six Flags, particularly at nightfall, do take on a different tone. It's once when the bustle of the crowd dies down a little bit, and quite honestly, we don't often think of it, but it really is a very beautiful and at this point historic park. I mean, Six Flags has been there a long time at this point, and some of the older portions of the park have some just incredibly gorgeous oak trees and spaces that are naturally beautiful and evocative in and of themselves.
Oh, I agree, and that entire area is, a lot has happened in that entire area that has always just struck me as you're going through that space, as staying with you.
It does.
And from Six Flags, it's not that far to Merrimack Cavern either.
No, it's not. It's not. And I am regretful to say that at this moment I have not been to Merrimack Caverns yet, and I want to go very, very much.
I've been, but it's been a long time since I've been there. And for those that have been in the Ozarks for a long time, you don't see them as much now, but there are a few left. Most of them have the paint faded, but there were a number of barns that were painted with signs for Merrimack Cavern as advertising. And I know just, from my childhood forward, particularly going to St. Louis and so forth, and you would see these barns, and then over the years, the paint gradually fading, but still there, and Merrimack's still there, very active, and the Merrimack River is beautiful. I've floated it before, but the cavern is quite historic and by some accounts haunted.
And it's a 4.6 mile cavern system. Certainly on I-44, I'm happy to report the Merrimack's marketing presence is really robust at this point. They've rejuvenated a number of the signs, and we even have a remaining barn on Highway 65 advertising Merrimack Caverns. So it's it reminds me of being on I-75 and seeing Sea Rock City and Ruby Falls. It's very
Yeah.
much in that vein. Two places I really, really like. But it was rumored to be a hideout for Jesse James.
Yes. And there's a lot of emotion tied up in those tales with people. There are some who have doubted, some historians have doubted whether or not the James Gang actually was at Merrimack Cavern. But I think it's entirely possible, because one of the places that they tended to lay low at was not that far away from there, and was the residence of a doctor and actually the younger brothers, of course, were cousins to the James brothers and in the gang together. When after the Northfield bank robbery went awry and Cole and Jim Younger ended up in prison, one of the daughters of the doctor that they would stay with, not far from there, ended up in Minnesota and lobbied for 20 some years for their release. And so they certainly were in the general vicinity. And but it certainly is a romantic notion, and it's been years since I've been there, but you go in and they have the mannequins set up of the James Gang and everything, as if they were in there cooking over a fire and so on and so forth. And it would make you think, were they really there or not, and you'd like to think they were. They might have been.
And something that really has taken on a life of its own, that it is admittedly a mid-century American pastiche, but it's one that I love, and it's one that we seem to have regrettably, in many cases, in many tourist locations, have moved past. Is this this imagery of the American outlaw romanticized within a timeless, almost out of space, out of time, but old-fashioned context, or almost diorama. In exactly what you described, it is something that is certainly referenced in an earlier iteration of Silver Dollar City, with the original Fire in the Hole and the flooded mine, and lots of other attractions of these types. It reminds me to a degree, it reminds me of visiting Vicksburg and seeing the now defunct husk of a museum that was built in the shape of a Mississippi River ironclad gunboat, now in the shadow of a comparatively new Hampton Inn. and I love Vicksburg, just for the right. I love Vicksburg, and
I like Vicksburg
and Natchez. They enjoy an enormous amount of underlying rivalry based on the fact of the extraordinary hardships of the people of Vicksburg in terms of holding out of the siege, and the fact that comparatively not very far down the river, Natchez was said, "We surrender," and we are not going through a siege. and of course did not go through the hardships of a Union gunboat and military stranglehold. But within this process, it reminds me, I want to get back to Vicksburg. And just for the record, Jamie's Cafe has probably the best grouper sandwiches I've ever had. I digress. But along with that, the Merrimack theming, I think it is extremely powerful. It is a historical narrative in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it is it is one part artifice, two parts homage. It performs an incredibly important role in the psyche of America in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how we view the outlaw, how we view the outlaw within the context of society and the modern society, and how we are able to romanticize these images and then bring them into the present. And in essence, a generation of 1950s, 1960s, 1970s little boys growing up and not necessarily knowing the full context of Jesse James, but knowing it was okay to pretend to be him.
Yeah.
And go to these sites like Merrimack Caverns and vicariously experience the a almost otherworldly imagining your outlaw hero fighting against the odds in a dark magical cave that lights up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's pretty much how it's portrayed. Yeah.
Which I love. I think it to me, am really taken by this type of roadside attraction, and in part because as the American psyche has thought of itself as having matured. I don't think it really has, but it thinks of itself as having matured. It's very easy to be condescending about these sorts of things without understanding just how important this longer standing narrative that really is tying early settlement and the Civil War into the present in ways that I think have impacted. Now, it'd be impossible to actually study this, I think, in terms of actual numbers, but how many little boys in the 50s and 60s didn't grow up to have a deep appreciation, affiliation for example, Civil War history, American history, in some cases serving in terms of the resurgence of historical reenactment, etc.
Oh, I think it does play a role, and certainly I think that it served a role of igniting the imagination that something unique happened here. And we often talk about that, people think nothing happened where they live, nothing happens at home or ever happened here. And these kind of spots, I do think help spark that imagination that not only did something happen, but it was something unique and that wasn't necessarily replicated a million times coast to coast.
No, in those types of moments, it is a combination of folklore, historical record, combined, quite honestly, with some freewheeling touristic capitalism. And again, I think it's easy to be very snobbish about these things. It's easy to be condescending and get up on your high horse and think that you know everything without realizing that, first of all, these types of attractions, which may be haunted, uh, are serving incredibly important purposes in the larger narrative, but also these attractions are themselves part of our culture and our cultural history.
Very much so. And on the subject of the haunting, I've always found it seems a little ephemeral. I mean, a little thin as to the exact nature of why it's haunted. But on the other hand, there is a theme of haunted caves throughout the Ozarks, and it's something, and I think it's something in and of itself that caves tend to bring out hauntings, so to speak.
Oh, they do. And not just in the United States, but worldwide,
True.
caves are. And some of it is very common sense. Some of it is deeply archetypal.
Hmm.
The common sense aspect of it is, and ask almost anybody who has worked as a cave guide or maintenance in the show caves, etc. You get into these spaces and sounds start doing weird things just because of the acoustics of the structure.
Hmm. And then sometimes they take on certain types of sounds, music that shouldn't be there, things like that. And so certainly, and a lot of these places, including Merrimack, have been inhabited off and on in various ways, whether it's long term or as a hideout for a time period for eons. And so we really don't know what else happened there that might influence a haunting, or just to absorb all of the energy.
It is, and it's, of course, some of the show caves in Missouri and in Arkansas as well were not did not have human interaction before they became show caves.
Right.
Cosmic Caverns in Bearville and Talking Rocks Caverns in Branson West were two that were opened comparatively late in the mining and the settlement process, and then almost in some cases rapidly transitioned into becoming show caves. But first of all, I'm not sure. I haven't heard of any specific hauntings associated with Talking Rocks. There are hauntings associated with Cosmic Caverns, but some pretty dramatic full body apparition experiences. And at the same time, many other caves, Bluff Dweller Cave in Knoll, and Small and Cave and Ozark, and many locations were essentially sacred sites for in most cases for the Osage.
Yes. And so, so there certainly could be a haunting there, and or it may be more of a residual absorption of various things that have, energies of various events there over time. But it's certainly, it's beautiful. It's very, it's very evocative, and I encourage people to go if you have not been. I love caves anyway, so
I do too.
So it's definitely worth going if you're going to be in the area. So encourage that.
And of the tens of thousands of people on I-44, a good chunk of you are going to be in the area.
Yes, that's true. Shifting from caves.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, when you get down I-44 Route 66 to the Rolla area, you have goats. or rather Goatman.
This is a fascinating bit of folklore meeting urban lore, and really speaks to the subject matter at hand. Devils in the Ozarks.
Yes.
Because of the goat motif, and the first part of this really looks like urban legend.
Yeah.
But it's the goat man of Phelps County.
And I'm not sure how far back the story goes. Of how far back it originated. I'm thinking, if I'm remembering right, the 50s or 60s.
And I want to back up for a moment. There are strong aspects of urban legend associated with this. That said, as we do in so many cases, that doesn't mean that I don't take individuals' personal experiences seriously, and I'm not demeaning or condescending those experiences.
Same.
And on that. And second of all, there are often deeply folkloric roots to a story that have very long lineage, that sometimes those folkloric aspects in some ways feed into what becomes a internet urban legend, etc. And so it can, part of the fun can be delineating all of that, and we'll really reference that heavily with Devil's Promenade toward the end. But I'm just curious, very curious about this particular story. Do want, if you are a Rolla native, if you're familiar with this story, if you've had experiences, we would love to hear more.
Yes.
We have what's on the internet, but what's on the internet is oftentimes just the beginning of a research path.
Exactly. And this Goatman story, it has some of the aspects of a lot of the other Goatman stories around the country, but then it has other aspects as well. It's centered around the Pine Hill Cemetery, which is between Rolla and St. James. It's also known as Spook Hollow by locals. And so you have the legend of the Goat Man, which basically is part man, part goat, vision, seen at night. But also you have tales of seeing phantom cars coming down the road and disappearing near the cemetery. But not necessarily an explanation of why the two are happening in the same place, which I find interesting.
And something else that jumps out to me in this particular bit of lore is Goatman, in some cases, seems to be a ghost himself, and in other cases seems to be presiding over or protecting, or in some way associated with these rural cemeteries.
Yeah. And then, of course, in Kentucky, you have the famous Goatman Bridge, which is a different kind of tale, but again, sometimes portrayed as flesh and blood, sometimes portrayed as spirit, but centered around a train trestle.
There's many different aspects of this. I think in just as you say, just as the word or the place name Devils captures the attention, Goatman does something similar. And I think that in large part, our association or contextualized association, particularly for those of us of European descent. Associating goats with the devil is hard to get.
Yeah, and I do think that there's definitely implicit in the tales, that a shorthand for this is something inhuman, something perhaps evil, perhaps demonic, and but this tale, at least as far as I've been able to ascertain, not really an origin story with it. Perhaps there's a grave in the cemetery associated with a particular grave is associated, but it's not real clear. Or it's very ephemeral as far as the origin of why is this happening and why there. Again, not discounting any personal experiences, but I would love to know more about sort of that origin of why is it happening there.
I would too. And again, so if you have anything that you could share, you as the viewers could share, would like to share, we'd love to hear. We'd love to do some more research. We'd love to get on the ground in Phelps County and and check it out. And along with this, I think it deserves, just along with the devil's conversation, a little bit of discussion in terms of that cultural association between goats and the devil.
Yes, and I'm going to let you lead there because you're going to get to talk about one of your favorite movies.
One of my favorite movies, one of my favorite characters, and of course this the film The Witch, and it's I think it was released around 2016, and it's a situation in which theoretically a satanic force is tormenting a remote New England family in the 1600s is the basic gist, if you haven't seen it. And there's deeply allegorical aspects. There's a strange coming of age story for a teenage girl. There's lots of people disappearing in the forest. It is a horror film. It's a very slow, anxiety-inducing film. It's not a slasher film.
Right.
And
more psychological.
Yes. And the centerpiece of it is Black Phillip. They're the farm's black goat, who, depending upon one's perspective, may or may not be Satan. And it's, of course, watching I had multiple reactions. I do like the film. It's very well done. It pays interesting and powerful homage to the traditions and the questions of religion and witchcraft and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Beautifully filmed. Did I mention it's very anxiety inducing? So trigger warning. But it's probably one of my favorite, not favorite films for my favorite character. And I'm going to have people like really worried about me when I say this. My favorite character in the film is Black Phillip, the black goat. I like him better than the entire family because they're unbelievably neurotic and they mumble a lot. And
they were Puritans.
Yes. And the it's if you listen to the director's commentary, the director talks about how recalcitrant the goat was and the fact that the goat was just like a raging pain in the butt to to try to work with, and he wouldn't cooperate whatsoever. Which you can tell is the case if you're like me and you spent most of your childhood and early adolescence raising goats. You learn to read their body language, and I love the fact that this particular goat was featured in the film, but he really was not. It was a poor casting call for what they were going for, because the goat is meant to inspire apprehension.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the conceptual villain, again, depending on how you're reading the film. Is it
Right.
is it all just a neurotic um, sort of mass delusion on the part of this remote family that clearly is not eating well in the wilds of Massachusetts, or is it actually happening? And whether which direction you want to go with that is entirely up to you. But the goat is meant to inspire deep apprehension, and having raised many goats and many billy goats, my first and lasting impression on this particular character in the film was, oh my gosh, he's such a sweet boy. And he is a sweet billy goat. Uncooperative, obviously uncooperative, but very sweet. So as it went on, and the family dynamic turns upon itself, and these horrible things start being done by each other, and the forest looms, and the crops fail, and we don't have any locusts, but you get the idea. I actually experienced, I'm not entirely sure what this says about me, but 3/4 of the way through the film, I'm actually rooting for the goat. I'm like, come on, boy, come on. You are not in a good place. You are seriously not in a good place with this family, and things need to be done. And I can't help you. I'd like to help you, but I can't help you. So, come on, Philip. You can do it. Whatever it is you need to do, you can do it. And I know that was not the intended goal
Of the filmmaker, yeah.
of the filmmakers, but it was where I landed. But in part just because I've raised goats for so long. But yeah, but it is, I think, in terms of popular modern culture, it's certainly one of the most effective insertions of pop culture in terms of goat with the devil.
And I think it's important to note pop culture, because traditionally in North America, goats really are not associated with witchcraft, nor were they involved in, associated motif-wise at all with the Salem witch trials or anything. That's all much later.
It is. I did find out that the Black Phillip character was actually of the goat who played Black Phillip. His name was actually Charlie. And interestingly enough, the association of goat with devil was more of a continental European thing than it was a British thing or an English thing. And I think that probably has something to do with the fact that up until comparatively recently, goats, again, that the actual connotation of goats with the devil really didn't get inserted until likely the 20th century in terms of popular culture.
Right.
Because prior to modern communication and modern mass media, are much, not all, but certainly the bulk of our European settlement folklore was associated with England and the British Isles.
Very much so.
I was I was just browsing in my witchcraft of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the association of witches appearing to others as cormorants and also whales. So in that vein, I posit the witch whale.
Easily hidden behind the barn, huh?
Don't recommend dynamite. I've seen that YouTube video.
You went there. Well,
seriously, one of the first YouTube videos I ever watched in my life, and it still makes me laugh as hard as it did, watching the TV anchorman and surrounding people flee in terror as rancid whale parts rain down from the sky.
yes, I've seen that one.
We probably all have, but it made a inappropriately lasting impression on me.
Well, on that note, Springfield.
Yes, from rancid whale parts to Springfield. Springfield is, of course, it's really considered to be the birthplace of Route 66.
Yes. The first meetings to organize to basically form Route 66 happened in Springfield.
There are a lot of haunted locations in Springfield, a lot more than people know about. Of course, we've got Wilson's Creek Battlefield just to the south of town. One of my favorite locations is actually right on Route 66. It's the Gilloy's Theater.
Yeah.
And the Gilloy is haunted.
I have not had an experience there myself, but
I've written 2 articles on the Gilloys. It definitely has an energy about it, as many old time theaters do, and it's exquisitely beautiful. It's
yeah.
I can't help but think that the arabesque / Egyptian motif of the 1920s era movie palace doesn't somehow inspire a certain containment of spiritual energy. But one of my favorite stories associated with the Gilloys is a longtime projectionist who had worked at the Gilloys for most of his life. On a midnight New Year's Eve midnight screening of a film whose title suggests a rather inappropriate subject matter. Way back in the 60s, the movie was scheduled to begin at midnight, and the projectionist was up in the space with the door locked. Midnight came and went, and there was no beginning of film, and they discovered that he had suffered from a heart attack, essentially just moments before the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve.
Timing.
Yes. And
I was just going to say, projection rooms tend to be a focus of hauntings in a lot of theaters, actually.
And certainly the general lore for what I picked up when I was doing the interviews was that he, as a remaining lingering spirit, is essentially taken on the role of caretaker, because that was his role before, and we see that pretty regularly. What
very much attachment.
Yes, and not in a negative way, in the sense that you're continuing your old job, or you're making sure that the place is running the way you want it to, or you're just there to watch over the building. And in those cases, the idea is that that the haunting doesn't push back unless except with people who appear to be um, acting poorly toward the structure.
Yeah, which makes sense.
It
And
does.
another location very close there is the Shrine Mosque,
Yes. Yes.
and
Beautiful.
it is beautiful. And at one point, the Route 66 went right in front of it. I know that route had changed, would change, legs of it would change from time to time, but um, and of course, um, it's the area where Bonnie and Clyde kidnapped Officer Percival as their first kidnapped police officer. But the Shrine Mosque is also haunted. Um, I've investigated a number of years ago, um, and my personal experience was encountering upstairs a apparition of a child who appeared to be a young boy, and hearing just the word Tommy,
Mm.
and seemed to be playing and not unhappy, but just sort of in his own world, not to use not trying to be panistic or anything, but not necessarily that aware or interactive with what was going on presently, but and why there, who knows? But I know a number of people have had encounters there, but that was my experience during an investigation.
Interesting. And it is, it's an incredibly evocative structure and very,
It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. And um, they've a lot of events are put on there. Used to be circuses and a lot of music events to be put on there, etc. I encourage anyone to go see it. It is absolutely gorgeous.
it is. And another structure in North Springfield that certainly has gotten a lot of notoriety, and it's a very beautiful historic structure that you can tour, is the Pythian Castle.
Yes, yes. Um, and when the Pythian Castle was built, it was way out of town, and you had to take a trolley line out to it. And now, of course, everything's grown up around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is gorgeous. And it does, I mean, it's a huge limestone building that is very reminiscent of a castle, hence the name, built by the Pythians. And it served a variety of functions, from a home for the Pythians to prisoner of war hospital during World War II with Japanese and German soldiers, various purposes over the years. Sat empty for a number of years, was sold at silent auction, which I contemplated bidding on and backed out because I didn't have a lot of money at the time, and ended up I would have won the bid. But the fellow who bought this is in the 90s. He lived in a couple of rooms and worked on renovating part of it, held it for a few years, then sold it to the current owner, who has put a lot of money into it.
And it's a beautiful event location.
It is.
And it does have a lot of paranormal lore associated with the building. And I think even regardless of all of that, with its, especially with its, for people who are not familiar with the fraternal order of Pythias, it these castles or similar structures by the fraternal order functioned as both an orphanage and a nursing home or an old folks retirement facility simultaneously. And as a result, you are dealing with the concentration of an enormous amount of energy in the
And
sense of
emotion from people. Yeah.
lots of emotion. Individuals, essentially widows and orphans was largely and retired knights, quote unquote, of the fraternal order. And so you had children who had lost one or both of their parents um, coming into these spaces, and you also had the elderly who did not have others to care for them within these spaces, and that's a lot of emotion.
Yes. And then later the prisoner of war camp. So
Yes, there is a comparatively extensive below ground portions of the Pythian castle, including a long access tunnel that is reported to be haunted. Weirdly enough, but it hasn't been my experience when I was in the tunnel. But that's just me. It was one of my first informal ghost hunts. I was just there as a photographer, and then later the article. But it was really interesting because I was just so deeply fascinated by the structure, and and for that particular night, and as a cat, a disclaimer on this, haunted locations rarely perform.
yeah, it's not command performances.
No. So you can go to a location that's very haunted and have no experiences. You can go to a location that's very haunted and have experiences. You can go to locations you didn't know were haunted and have experiences. It's up to them. It's not up to us.
That's right.
In terms of that. I do distinctly remember, it was the Halloween season, and I was part of the tour, but just as a photographer, and being in the long tunnel, it's kind of pointed toward the college campus, and the crowd who was. It's funny because I think perception also does play important roles. The crowd was there because it was Halloween. It was a haunted tour, so they were all ready to get scared. And I was just there to photograph, so I wasn't there to get scared. And I remember being at one point getting kind of somewhat separated from everyone in this long tunnel and thinking to myself, this should be really spooky, but for whatever reason, it just feels like a really calm, not spooky space, whether the lights are on or not. And that was a very odd sensation. I was comparatively new to the process.
Well, but it's also maybe an indication that you're well suited for investigating.
Yeah. Making shrieky noises and flapping about usually doesn't serve much of a purpose.
No, it's I always find it amusing when go to locations and they actually try to see if they can surprise us or give us a jump scare, and are usually disappointed when it doesn't work.
Yeah. Jumping all the way over into Kansas, you want to talk about the witch grave?
I can, yeah. And there's actually there's two. In the research we have the one that's in Oak Hill Cemetery, and to me, and honestly, it's the one that is. You hear some people talk about it, but it's not really the witch's grave in that area. But on the internet, it seems to be, which that's an amusing thing too, because if you're in the area and you say the witch's grave around Galena, you're actually, most people are thinking of the Quaker Cemetery closer to Riverton, Kansas, which is west of town. And Oak Hill Cemetery is on the north side of town, basically up by Empire City. But the tale in Oak Hill Cemetery is that there is a witch's grave, and if you can find it, and because everyone that talks about it in that cemetery will tell you it's a different place, is my experience. And none of the tombstones that have been pointed out to me over time by people are particularly unusual.
Mhm.
Most of the tales are actually centered around, well, this is the witch's grave because you will see shadows moving around it, is tends to be the story. But I've had probably 4 or 5 different places in the cemetery pointed out to me by people swearing this is it. But and not really any backstory as to anything. Now, the Quaker Cemetery over by Riverton, there is what is locally known as the Witch's Grave. And it does have a fairly large tombstone from the late 1800s. And it has one of the typical Victorian epitaphs, the one that goes, well, once I was you, how's it go? I just went blank, but basically foretelling that, I was once young, and where you are, I once was, and where I am, you will be. And the tale of the witch's grave is centered around the epitaph itself, which it is not an incantation or anything unusual, other than a bit foreboding to make people think of their own mortality, I guess.
Which can be very unsettling in and of itself.
It can be. But again, the grave itself, there is no known tale of the woman that's buried there being a witch or having any unusual story about her, other than she died relatively young. If I recall, she was in her late 20s. But it's the tombstone is the story. And people will go out and look at it. And now there aren't really tales of shadows moving around it or anything like that, like at Oak Hill. But ironically, in Oak Hill, the area just adjacent to the general area that people tend to point out, supposedly being where the witch's grave is, was a pauper's field. And I kind of wonder if the shadows that are seen there, and I have been there a number of times. I've been there once when I think I saw a shadow move across the pauper's field, but I couldn't explain it. But it wasn't so distinct that you'd say that was a shadow person. My guess is whatever activity is there is probably from the pauper's field, and you have a number of unmarked, basically unmarked graves.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of the more urban lore aspects involve going to the witch's grave at 3:33 a.m., preferably standard time, not daylight savings time, because that would throw off the cosmological clock. Bear that in mind. And hearing disembodied voices, possibly seeing the apparition of the the ghost of the witch,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. I think there's, in terms of this phenomenon, both of these cemeteries have direct proximity to Route 66.
Yes, yes. Actually, the Quaker Cemetery at Riverton is right on Route 66, pretty much. Whereas Oak Hill is off, away from the highway. And ironically, I can say that locally, the internet stories here of the 3:33 a.m. and all of this, I've never heard that in my life associated with the cemetery.
It, the thing that I think three components to take into consideration, and there are across the North America, likely elsewhere, but certainly across the United States, there are lots and lots and lots of rumored quote unquote witches' graves.
Yes.
They're very plentiful. In that regard, I think that in terms of parsing it out for research, there's three particular aspects. One is a post 1950s pop culture inspired. I would say I'm going to be harsh in this particular regard. Ignorance inspired paranoia or panic, or the desire to get yourself super creeped out by a location, and the ignorance again inspired, for example, of just bits and pieces of hearsay and lore, or in the case of the to our modern ears unsettling Victorian era funereal epitaph, taking something that is not an incantation. It is meant to inspire, poetically inspire introspection and a reflection upon our own mortality, and taking that and somehow twisting that within our minds, largely subconsciously or unconsciously, into a something that it is not, and something that it cannot be and will not be, and potentially in this case a young woman who quite potentially had nothing whatsoever to do with witchcraft, only the tragedy of having died young and coming from a family with enough means to give her a beautiful memorial piece, that then 100 years or 120 years later, a bunch of postmodern pop culture hopped up on kids with no concept of history or culture or context, suddenly out there getting about at 3:30 in the morning, thinking that something spooky is going to happen. That is certainly a real aspect. The extreme opposite of that would be I just remembered the middle one. The middle one is, yes, we may have identified certain graves as having some sort of ominous quality to them, but as you mentioned with the Popper's Field, that there may be recognizable paranormal activity simply within that space.
Right.
That it's happening. It's just not what we're attributing it to.
Right. And I think another factor that became to mind while you were talking too, for the people now looking at these graves, I think it not only is it a product of saturation in pop culture, but also a distinct 180 turn away from studying classic poetry and literature, that more traditional education in literature would, at a drop of a hat, people would recognize what it was, that it was an inspirational verse versus something ominous.
Yes. And oh, and then the last one, which I think is perhaps the most um mm, the portentous, is the potential of some sites, which in all likelihood, if they are sites with this kind of portent, are likely not terribly recognizable. But one that is recognizable is the crypt of Marie Laveau.
Yeah.
And of course, that's outside of the Ozarks. However, hoodoo, and to some degree, voodoo, has a long tradition along the rivers, etc., dating back to before the Civil War. Now, in terms,
But no verses on it. No poetic
no,
verses on her tomb.
no. And at the same time, I'm just curious about your thoughts on this, because certainly from a conjure tradition, Marie Laveau's crypt holds very special significance.
Yeah.
The implication on that is that witches' graves, and we can't really seem to actually pin one down other than in Marie Laveau, and she wasn't a witch; she was a voodoo priestess. But from the outside looking in, certainly some pop culture similarities. But I think the psychological maelstrom that occurs around the idea of a witch's grave is that there is some sort of unknown conjure significance to the space.
That plus I think it is a fear of the idea that there are certain individuals that have access to powers or gifts that others are ignorant of.
Yeah.
And whether it's the location, the tomb itself having that significance, or just the representation that somehow, of course, the whole notion of a witch is that there is secret or hidden knowledge that they can use.
Yeah.
And whether people want to say they're frightened of it or intrigued, either way, if people are being honest, there's a bit of jealousy there that
Mm-hmm.
they're able to do something I'm not.
Yeah. And I think that there's something that is innate to human nature, and I'm going to go back to the old English tradition of the Clutie trees,
Okay.
the sacred wells, that spaces of magical power inspired, essentially inspired tourism, but inspired travel, inspired you went to the space and you wanted to take back a piece of the space with you to somehow share in its magic or share in its power. And I think that is an enduring, talk about deep archetypal qualities. It is an enduring aspect of human behavior, whether it is taught or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens at places of significance, even to the point that a variety of historic locations have to be protected at various times, because people will travel and then take chunks of the place with them.
Yeah. True. And break off pieces and so forth.
Yes, I just a little something for later. And it is it's one of these things we see the physical space as being imbued with some sort of power, and we want a piece of that with us. And I think that is certainly driving the the imagination in terms of these allegations of quote unquote witches' graves.
Oh, I think so. You know, as a means of sort of touching the source of sorcery.
Yes. And I think it's one of the things that I love about getting to do the podcast actually is we do get to dive into the deep and enduring archetypal psychology of what causes humans to act like humans, for better or worse, and something that's really both disturbing and comforting in terms of duality is that we really don't change. We just keep being human.
Yep. The costumes just change over time.
Yes. that they do. So in that regard, do we want to, speaking of just the human quotient, talk about Billy Cook?
Yeah, we'll do that, then we'll end with the promenade.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, Billy is an incredibly tragic story, just from beginning to end.
It is.
And I'm not sure how what this exactly says about me. My heart goes out to the victims of Billy Cook, but my heart also goes out to Billy Cook himself.
I do too, and that's one of those things it's easy to vilify, and he did some atrocious crimes, murdered 6 people, and kidnapped others, all in a space of 22 days. But I think if all we do is vilify, then we get no closer to hopefully understanding and hopefully over time getting to a place where human nature or society changes enough to prevent some of these things from happening repeatedly over time. You can stick your head in the sand all you want, but that doesn't change what is happening to people. And we started off with Bonnie and Clyde and talking about Clyde Barrow, and Billy Cook is sort of the book into that. Ironically, he was born in 1928, so he was born was a toddler as Clyde Barrow was, very young man coming out of jail and not adapting well and ending up on a very long crime spree that lasted over 2 years. And Billy ended up kind of following the same path, but his spree was much shorter, with fewer victims, but in some ways more shocking, and perhaps because by 1950 we weren't having this rash of bank robberies and gangsters like we were in the 30s. So I think people had settled down after World War II and were enjoying their perception of everything's safe now, and we just have a nice white picket fence and we're insulated, and then, oh my gosh, this happens. But to step back a second, to understand how we get to 1950, Billy's story really started when he was 5. There were a number of half siblings from his father's first marriage, and then he had 2 sisters, full sisters with his mother and father. He was the youngest. He had a deformity that meant one of his eyelids would not close. And he was teased a lot about that. And then when he was 5, his mother died. And by all accounts, she was murdered. And his own description of it is pretty telling, that to some of the court psychiatrists, he related that, quote, "One time my sister and me came home from playing at a yellow house and found her dead, lying on a cot. She had a large gash in the head." And it was noted that he did not appear to grieve or miss her. The conclusion of the psychiatrist was that Billy most likely witnessed his father killing his mother, although his father was never charged. And then shortly after the mother dying, the father abandoned Billy and his sisters. In some of the reports, it says the cave, but it was basically an abandoned mine shaft.
Yeah.
And they were found and put into the juvenile justice system, and placed in foster homes. And his sisters were put in 2 separate homes, and neither of those families would take Billy. And ostensibly, it was said it was because of his deformity. He ended up in a foster home of a woman that basically she and her husband fostered children as their means of income.
Mm-hmm.
And records make it pretty clear over time there was a lot of physical abuse that went on in the home, mental abuse, as well as apparently sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say at an event that we had several years ago, a lady that was centered on this topic, lady came up and talked to me afterwards, and her mother had been friends with one of Billy's sisters, a good friend, growing up. And she relayed to me what her mother would say, that Billy's foster mother would not allow him to speak to any of the family, and that his sister and her mother would walk over to his foster home, go down the alley, and there was a board fence on the backyard, and they would wait. And they figured out that Billy did a lot of the chores in the house, and there were a number of children, foster children, at any given time. And one of the things he had to do was the laundry, and he was small for his age. Even the time of his arrest, he was a smaller man, just like Clyde Barrow. And they figured out about what time of the afternoon he would take the laundry out to put on the clothesline. So they would wait in the alley, and there was a knot hole in the fence. So his sister Pearl could speak through the fence to him, and they could see him, and he was so small that he would have to jump and try to throw clothes over the clothesline. Mm-hmm. And he would talk to her through the fence, but they couldn't really see each other. And that was the only contact he had with family for years. That kind of gives you an idea.
It does. And at a very young age, he ultimately gets sent to the penitentiary at Jeff City.
Right. But even before that, at age 12, he was running away from foster home to get away from circumstances, gets pulled into juvenile court, and he begs the judge to send him to reform school rather than send him back to his foster mother.
Yeah.
So that's what they did. And he was there until he was 17. And they when he got out, his comment was later about it that his time at the Missouri Training School was that the training I received there was how to steal cars and pick locks.
Yeah.
And he was there until he was 17 and comes back home. By then, both of his sisters are married. And he lives at one of their houses and then the other. One of the brothers-in-law, basically gets him a job, then steals his paycheck. The other one gets him involved in some petty theft, and he ends up in court again, and his probation is revoked. And so they then send him to the state penitentiary in Jefferson City at age 17. And he's there until he's 20.
Mm-hmm.
And
it really, I mean, the things that apparently happened to him at the penitentiary are things that are difficult to discuss even on a platform like this.
yes. I mean, very severe physical injuries, sexual assault. At 20, he gets out, comes back to Joplin, can't find a job, and gets frustrated and basically leaves town, telling his father that he guesses that he'll live by the gun.
Mm-hmm. And he does.
Well, he ultimately does, but he hitchhikes out to California, to the desert, to Blytheville, and he gets a job in a diner washing dishes, and it's really is the only job he ever had. He's there for 8 or 9 months, and things seem to be going okay. And then basically something snapped, and no one really knows, and even the psychiatric reports, they really don't know what the spark was. But he basically one day hitchhiked to Texas. He bought a gun, and he then kidnapped a mechanic and put the guy in the trunk of his own car, drove around, and while making a slow turn, the owner of the car was able to force the trunk lid open with a tire iron that was in the trunk and jumped out. And basically he was heading back up this direction, up Route 66, and runs out of gas between Tulsa and Claremore, Oklahoma. And a car stops because he's acting like he's having car trouble, and picks him up as a hitchhiker. And that's the Mosier family.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mosier family was a family, Carl and Thelma, 33 and 29. They were young parents, had 3 children. Ronald was 7, Gary was 5, Pamela Sue was 3, and the family dog was in the car. They were from Illinois, and they were on their way to New Mexico on vacation. And they stopped and picked him up, and then Billy forced him to drive around aimlessly for 3 days. And to be honest, Mr. Mosier probably didn't think much about picking him up. A lot of people hitchhiked. This was a young kid. He was 20 years old. Not a big kid either. And I'm sure he was not expecting that to get in, basically the dangerous person to get in the car. And basically, around Wichita Falls, Texas, Mr. Mosier tries to get the jump on Billy to get the gun away from him. It doesn't work. Mrs. Mosier and the children start crying. Billy, at that point, loses it. He shoots them all, even the dog, and then he drives them back in the blood-soaked car to Joplin from Wichita Falls and hides the bodies in an abandoned mine shaft outside. It says outside Joplin, it really wasn't. It was off 2nd Street in West Joplin. And I've had people give me personal accounts that are rather eerie in this regard. One was at a book signing once. Older gentleman comes up and to tell me the story. His father was one of the police officers that found the Mosier family bodies. That he said a number of days before that, and thinking back, they figured out it was probably when he got into town with them. Billy showed up at their house, and he knew the officer. He had arrested Billy before, he knew him. Showed up and knocked on the door and asked him if he had any feed stats he could have. I guess they had a farm. And the fellow told me his dad said, I don't have anything for you, Billy. You just, need to get out of here. And then a number of days later, they find the bodies, and his dad put 2 and 2 together that he probably had the bodies in the car when he was talking to him. Another event the elderly fella was at relayed the story that he figured out after the fact that he talked to Billy the night that he dumped the bodies. He was 15 at the time, and he and a friend, it was out in mining field at the time where the shaft was, and there was a mining shack out there. And he and a friend had gone out there to play cards, and they weren't supposed to play cards. Their parents didn't want to play cards, but they went out there to play cards. And while they're in the shack, door opens, and it's Billy walks in and is talking to them, and in fact tells him his name and everything, and wants to know what they're doing. And we're playing, we're playing cards. And he said, I don't know why I said it, but I said, our folks will be coming looking for us before long. Mm-hmm. And Billy talked to him for a few more minutes and then turned around and left. And he said, I've often wondered after the fact if me saying that our folks might be coming looking for us saved us from getting killed that night. Mm. So I mean, it's very possible. So you get these tidbits that add to the story that have not been told before, and so it really does give you that connotation. But Billy basically then heads back out to California, hitchhiking, makes it out there, kidnaps a traveling salesman from Seattle, and ends up killing him. Then he kidnaps 2 fellas that are out hunting, and forces them to take him to Mexico. And that portion of the story is what's covered in the classic movie, The Hitchhiker.
Right. Right. Which is a great film. It really
is. And is the reason that your mother told you not to pick up hitchhikers. So
that it is. That it is. And the film concludes with the character, which is similar in real life to Billy being captured in Mexico.
Yes, it is. And in real life, they did a scene on the docks, but real life, it was in the city market. By this point, Billy he had left the receipt for the gun he bought in the Mosier family car, so they had his name. And by this point, the day that he got caught in Mexico is the same day they found the Mosier family bodies in Joplin, actually. And he was the subject of the largest manhunt in U.S. history up to that point. Officers in, I think it was 22 states, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, and the federal police in Mexico were all involved. And so there had been all points bulletins sent out everywhere. And they had kind of figured out the direction he was going. And so a couple of interesting things along the point. He ended up at one point stopping back in the little town in California, Blythefield, that he had, in Blythe, that he had worked in the diner at. And a local deputy who was actually married to a waitress in the diner, Homer Waltrip was the deputy's name, and his wife was Cecilia. Deputy Waltrip began wondering if the man in the APB was the man that had worked with his wife. And so he went out to the motel that Billy had lived at when he worked there, because he had a roommate. He went out there to talk to the fella and knocked on the door, and Billy answered the door and got the drop on him, and forced him to drive him around in the patrol car. And after about 40 miles, told the deputy to pull over, had him lay down a ditch, told him he was going to shoot him, but he stood over him for a few minutes and then left. And after he was captured, they asked him why he didn't kill the deputy. And he said because his wife was the only person who had been nice to him in his life. And then when he was captured, the local police chief recognized him from the bulletins and got the drop on him in the city market and grabbed the gun out of his belt. And apparently the first thing that he said was, do they hang you in Oklahoma? So there had been some debate about exactly where the Mosier family had been murdered, whether it was in Oklahoma or Arkansas or Missouri. But he was tried in Oklahoma for it, and from that statement, my guess is that is where they were killed. He was sentenced over 300 years in prison on those cases, and then extradited to California to stand trial for the murder of the salesman, and ultimately was sentenced to death there, went to San Quentin.
Bringing this back to Route 66, Billy, between the situation that occurs after his death in Comanche, Oklahoma, and then his final unmarked interment in Peace Church Cemetery, which with direct association is really the conclusion of, in this case, society-made devil. Sometimes I hesitate to use those terms, but that's what we're looking at. Because Billy's body is placed on display in Comanche, Oklahoma.
Yes, a funeral director in Comanche, Oklahoma, which Comanche didn't have any connection to the story directly, other than he saw an opportunity. Had been in the business long enough. He remembered that some of the gangsters in the 30s being put on public display when they were killed, including the Barker gang. And so he actually came to Joplin, talked to Billy's father, and got permission to go claim the body from San Quentin for $50. He paid Billy's father $50. So he drove his hearse out to San Quentin, claimed the body. 3 days later, was back in Comanche, had the body on public display. And after the first day, wasn't happy with the number of people viewing the body. He was charging 50 cents a head, added loudspeakers, and kind of turned it into almost like a carny sideshow. And this went on for about a week, and the family found out about it. And one of the sisters, ironically, whose husband had kind of contributed to him going down this path, hired an attorney, and they got a court order getting the body back. Yeah. And so his body was on display for about a week, and they said over 12,000 people paid to see his body. So this funeral director made about $6,000 in 1951 off of this.
And ultimately, coming back to Peace Church Cemetery, which is at times reported to be haunted by Billy. Now, there's a lot of reasons for paranormal activity in Peace Church Cemetery, separate from Billy, but he is interred there in an unmarked grave.
Yes, and actually, the body was escorted back by police, and it was timed to arrive at midnight, so that there wouldn't be a lot of people there. And actually, 2 police officers were there, a newspaper reporter, minister, who was minister for the Cook family, and his wife and baby daughter. And so they actually buried him in the family plot by the light of the car headlights. And one of the hauntings that's told there is that there's the disembodied cries of a baby. And another tale told to me personally was at an event was elderly woman was there with her daughter, and she says that she thinks she is the baby heard crying there because she was the baby daughter of the minister. And her mother said that as soon as they got to the cemetery, she started crying and did not stop crying until they left.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't know why, but I've always had the feeling that when they talk about a baby crying, that they're hearing me as a baby, which might be.
It could be. It's such an interesting conjecture. And Peace Church Cemetery is an exceptionally evocative location.
It is. And then ultimately, as the public started hearing that he was buried there were those that were making threats of desecrating the family plot and so forth. So he was disinterred and then buried in an unmarked grave nearby. And then ultimately, with our theme of the devil, ultimately in the 1980s, was used as a defense in a murder trial. A very tragic circumstance of some teenage boys bludgeoning a boy to death that they went to school with, who um, had special needs and was very trusting. And in fact, the last of the convicted murderers of the boy was just recently released from prison. But they tried to use an insanity defense and claimed that they had been at Peace Church Cemetery involved in satanic worship. This is, of course, in the 80s, in the midst of the satanic ritual scare across the country, and they tried to make use of it. And that they were trying to summon the spirit of Billy Cook. And tried to use this as to show we're crazy and shouldn't be convicted. The jury was not convinced, and they were all convicted of murder.
And then,
so, yeah.
We began our Dark Underbelly tour of Route 66 with discussions including the Chain of Rocks Bridge crossing.
Yes, part one. Yes.
And bridges have long held great significance for ritual, for conjuring. And in this case, we're going to conclude tonight's episode with another bridge on the opposing end of the Ozarks, directly associated with the Route 66 corridor, and that is the Devil's Promenade.
Yes. And yes, technically the Devil's Promenade is not on Route 66 itself, but very close by, and certainly in an area not very far from Spooklight Road, which has a direct association with Route 66 in some of the theories to explain the light being lights from Route 66 or now I-44.
Which really shows the proximity of Devil's Promenade and the Devil's Promenade Bridge to the route and within that corridor space. We are talking about, first of all, a location that, in terms of early settlement and then lore being injected into regional culture, not pop culture, but regional culture, a bridge with the mystique of hearing phantom horse hooves, horsebeat, the horses running on the bridge. And this is, of course, echoed without being specifically named with the tourist walking bridge at Silver Dollar City that was built fairly early on in the development of the city, 1960s, 1970s. But that original bridge is long gone. New bridge is there, but there is a extraordinary column of limestone that rises up out of the Spring River, creating a portion of the bluff on the north side of the bridge. There's public access on the south side of the bridge, but that north side is longstanding Quapaw tribal land.
Yes, and before that, it was ritual land for the Osage, and the bluff, the promenade itself is the outcropping of limestone, and it's very prominent. And in fact, I have an early photo where you see that there are Native Americans actually sitting on the different notches of the promenade, and it's very evocative. But some of the early lore from the Osage is that a chief was actually beheaded at the promenade. Sort of vague tales as to the reason, but basically that, somehow he had betrayed his people and he was beheaded. And there's sort of an homage to that actually from that they did when Downstream Casino opened nearby, which actually sits at the corner of Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas. the driveways in Missouri, the parking lots in Kansas, and the casinos in Oklahoma. That one of the first commercials for the casino actually was done at the promenade, depicting the Indian chief standing with his hands raised, and local lore is that it was an homage to that story. Later, the land belonged to the Quapaws, still does. There's a cemetery on top of the bluff as well. But it was settlers who ended up naming it the Devil's Promenade. And it much more is, that part of the story is much more settler lore. Early on, there was a wooden bridge over Spring River there, and the tales grew up that you could summon the devil, generally at midnight, standing in the middle of the road or the bridge. Some versions I've heard, you're supposed to turn in a circle 3 times. Some you call the devils 3 times. Sometimes you just stand there, but that you hear horses running across the bridge, and it's supposed to be the devil's horses. In some versions, you will see the devil himself. Now, the Quapaw will tell you that you can summon little people on the bridge as well.
Mm-hmm. And based on that lore, whether that's white settler lore or Quapaw lore, neither are entities that are recommended.
No. The little people are not Disney fairies. They are much more akin to the Irish fairies, tricksters, deceivers, lure people into the woods, not to come back, sometimes supposedly, even kill people. But the stories are that you can leave sweets out on the bridge, and the little people will reveal themselves to you, and you never want that.
No, you do not. And I think that's a positive, well, actually a dark cautionary tale. The tales of Route 66 at times are incredibly dark, and there are cautions along the way to tread lightly within these spaces.
Yes, and they coexist right along the kitsch Americana version of it.
Yes, they do.
So as you travel Route 66, just keep a wary eye out. And don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Boats and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be going live, taking your questions and flying without a net. It's going to be fun. You can catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.